afternoon. Anin Kwe. Welcome to DWF Live. My name is Riley Goldsmith, and I am the Director of Programs and Operations for the Gord Downie and Chani Wenjack Fund. As we gather today throughout Canada or Turtle Island, we remind you that we are situated on Indigenous lands, both treaty and unceded. This land is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. And as a country, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land in which we live and work. Inspired by Chani's story and Gord's call to build a better Canada, the Gord Downie and Chani Wenjack Fund aims to build cultural understanding to create a path toward reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Our goal is to improve the lives of Indigenous people by building awareness, education, and connections between all peoples in Canada. We were created out of two families coming together to make change, uphold Chani and Gord's legacies, and create a pathway on the journey toward reconciliation. We would like to thank our friends at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants for hosting these sessions for us, and we hope that you will continue to learn more on your own path toward reconciliation. And now I'll pass it over to Joe, who will be your host for today's session.
All right, Riley, thank you so much. Always great to see you, and thank you for that introduction today. I'm going to tuck you backstage for now and say hello to all the classrooms we have joining us live today. It's always great to see the registrations. We have over 80 classrooms registered for today's event. They're joining us from all across Canada. I've got a few classrooms who are giving shout outs already in the chat. We've got classrooms in Ottawa, classrooms in Brantford, in Mississauga, looks like Thornhill, Burnaby, British Columbia. So keep using that chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from today. And of course, when the time comes, we want to be able to grab your questions for our speaker today. So let's get right to it. Let's bring our speaker in. We've got Waubgeshig Rice joining us. He's an Anishinaabe writer and journalist, originally from Wasauksing First Nation. He's written 3 works of fiction, most recently the national bestseller, Moon of the Crusted Snow. He lives in Sudbury, Ontario with his wife and his 2 sons. And we're going to spend a little time getting to know him today before we turn the classrooms loose. So I'm going to bring Waub in live with us right now. Hey, Waub, how you doing?
Hey, Joe, I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?
Good, good. Well, look, it's so awesome to have you joining us live today. Like I mentioned, we have a ton of students who are excited to get to know a little bit more about you today. And then I have a feeling they're going to have lots of questions.
Well, great, Chimigwech. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm honored and humbled to be with you all this afternoon. Big thanks to the Chani and Wenjack Fund for bringing us all together today. It's a great honor, as I mentioned. What I'll do today is talk a little bit about my upbringing in my community and how that shaped me as an author and a journalist. And I'll tell a little bit of the origin story of Moon of the Crested Snow, because I know a lot of you students have read it already or you're about to read it. Don't worry, I won't have any spoilers here for you. I'll just talk about the background and some of the discussions that we can have around it. So when it comes time to open it up to you all in about 10 minutes or so, feel free to ask me about anything, about my career as an author, about my career as a journalist, even though I won't be touching on that too much in this part, in my opening. I did work a long time for CBC, and I'd be happy to answer your questions about that. Or if you just like to know what it's like to grow up in a First Nation and then move to the city and then study journalism and then try to become an author and then, being a dad, that's the most important thing to me right now. And I'm just very happy to talk about myself, and I appreciate any opportunity. So I will introduce myself formally in a moment, but before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that today the world is witnessing an unjust act of aggressive imperialism. So I would like to acknowledge the people of Ukraine, and I wish them safety and good health, and I hope for a peaceful resolution there in Eastern Europe. So, bonjour, Waubgeshig Rice. Makwatan no dem Wasauksing Donjaba Nishnabe Minwa Jagana Shinda Minwa and Swakamakindeda. My name is Waubgeshig Rice. You may call me Waub for short if you like. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasauksing First Nation. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian descent. That just means that my dad is from the res and my mom is from town. And I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario, which is also known as Swakamak, and it is the traditional territory of Atikamekw Anishinaabe. And where I live now and where I'm originally from are lands that are part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And that is a treaty that was signed in 1850 and, of course, predates Canadian Confederation. So if you'd like to learn more about treaty history, I strongly encourage you to, because those are the documents and agreements that were supposed to create more of a harmonious existence here amongst settler and Indigenous people. But as we know, didn't actually work out that way. Still, there's a lot we can learn from those efforts, and I urge everyone to do that, to go forward in the spirit of what we now call reconciliation. So I grew up in my community in the 1980s and 90s during a time when the grown-ups were doing some pretty important work to reconnect with and reclaim our Anishinaabe heritage after some decades of tragedies and traumas as a result of being displaced and colonized people. There were some very tragic events that happened, and that eventually led people like my parents and their peers and the elders to decide that they wanted to break those cycles, and they wanted to reverse the harm of colonialism on my generation in particular and the generations to come. So they decided that to do that would be through practices like bringing the drum back into our community, beginning ceremonies again, like sweat lodges and fasts, and cultural celebrations like powwows, and most importantly, taking hold of our educational outcomes. And what that looked like was managing to acquire control of our schooling and expand our on-reserve school. So prior to my, involvement in school, before I was in kindergarten, the school in our community was called Ryerson Indian Day School. So it was a day school. Kids went there and they weren't allowed to, speak their language or practice their culture or anything. It was, again, an assimilative tool of the Canadian government. And after they were done senior kindergarten, they'd go into nearby Parry Sound, where their schooling would continue. However, during this moment of Renaissance in the early to mid 1980s, when I was a young child, the adults and the community leadership decided that they wanted to lobby the federal government to acquire control of the school and to expand it up to grade 8. So fortunately, I was amongst the first cohort of those kids who graduated from grade 8 in what was then called Wasauksing First. So I, grew up going to our school on the reserve, benefited in many, many ways, learning the language a little bit, learning a lot about our history and our culture through visits by elders and other knowledge keepers and so on, and engaging in some really key land-based learning that, involved going out into the bush, harvesting medicines, learning about them, learning how to set snares and nets and that kind of thing. So I had a very keen understanding of what it meant to be Anishinaabe from a very early age. And that has really set the course for the rest of my life. And now that I'm a father, I think it has equipped me with some good practices to hopefully raise my own kids in the same way. So I feel very fortunate that the adults in my community made those efforts when I was a child, because it has had widespread positive impacts. And for me, one of the biggest impacts was learning about stories. I mentioned that we would have elders come and visit our classroom on a regular basis, and they would share stories with us, like about Nana Bush, the trickster figure, or about, local history or family history, language lessons, and so on. And when those elders would come in and visit with us, we would sit on the floor and we would look up at them in the chair, and it was a very communal, very wholesome experience. And it became sort of a tangible thing for me to connect to my culture by the storytelling experience, by witnessing these stories together with my relatives and with my peers and so on. So I understood just how key that was to our culture's survival over the course of several generations that endured these brutal practices at the hands of the Canadian government. Right. And, throughout, obviously, I also learned how to read and write and became very intrigued by that. And then by the time I got to high school off reserve, I saw really the core differences between those kinds of storytelling, and really just how there were some major differences in culture, not just in the ways that we expressed ourselves, right? In how we gathered and how we learned and so on. So in grade 9 English, I learned that storytelling was basically reading, It was more of a solitary experience involving just yourself looking at a book and interpreting things on your own, and perhaps sharing it with other people in your classroom. And in all those books I read in high school back in the 1990s, there were no Indigenous people reflected whatsoever, either as authors or as characters or as experiences or anything like that. Back in the 90s, we predominantly read books by white male authors, and that was just the truth. That's how the curriculum was set up, based on the white patriarchy that dominated our country and still continues to dominate our country in different ways. I just accepted that, you know, as a teenage kid in the 90s, you just sort of think that that's the way it is. And I still enjoyed English class. I really liked reading and creative writing and so on. And I began to excel at it. It became my favorite class, and I got, you know, my best marks in English and so on. By the time I was in about grade 11, there was this auntie of mine, Auntie Elaine Bunn. She was one of my first teachers in the school on the reserve when I was a kid. And she had a really keen interest in my educational path from that point on. So she always checked in with me while I was in high school to see how things were going. And one day at a family function, she asked, hey, Wob, how's school going? And I said, oh, yeah, it's going good. You know, getting good marks. I was an honor student. And she said, yeah, so what's your favorite class? And I said, oh, it's English class. And she said, oh, yeah, why is that? And I said, well, you know, I really like reading and I like the writing assignments, you know, have a lot of fun doing all those things. And she said, oh, yeah, who are you reading? What are the authors that you're reading? And I said, oh, you know, like Shakespeare and W.O. Mitchell and J.D. Salinger and Sir William Golding and so on and so on. You know, the aforementioned list of white dudes who are mostly dead, right? And she said, oh, yeah, okay. And that's sort of where the story ended, or the conversation ended. But afterwards, you know, for gifts for my birthday or for Christmas, she started giving me books by Indigenous authors. People like Richard Waughemes, Lee Miracle, Thomas King, Louise Erdrich, all these trailblazing Indigenous authors who were doing monumental things back in the 80s and 90s that I didn't know about because that wasn't part of our official learning through the Ontario curriculum, right? But she took it upon herself to expand my world and open my eyes to these efforts of the people who were doing really important things to document Indigenous realities in fiction and in literature more broadly. And that changed my world. From there, I took writing a little more seriously. I started dreaming that perhaps I'd one day become a published author. And fortunately, I was able to do that. Finally, in the year 2011, my first collection of short stories called Midnight Sweat Lodge was published by Thetis Books. And those stories are more or less based on stories I wrote as a teenager about, you know, my experiences growing up on the reserve. So in between all that, though, obviously, there was a journalism career. There was a university experience at the place that will soon formerly be called Ryerson University. At the same time, I kept doing this fiction. And I think one thing that we're going to talk about this afternoon briefly is Moon of the Crusted Snow. So I'll just tell a really quick story about how Moon of the Crusted Snow came together, and then I'll open it up to your questions. So Moon of the Crusted Snow, if you're not familiar with it, it's a post-apocalyptic story of sorts about Northern Ontario First Nation that endures a world-ending blackout. And as this crisis unfolds, people in the community are more adept at coping with it because they have some of that land-based knowledge. They know how to go out into the land to get their food and their medicine, and they know how to stay warm and so on. So this blackout that has changed the world hasn't had that drastic of an impact on this community quite yet. However, some unwanted visitors come into the community from a city to the south, and that heightens the tension, and the community has to make some tough decisions about what to do with these outsiders, all the while contending with this major catastrophe. So the origin of that, when I first got the idea of potentially exploring a story like that, was way back in 2003. In the summer of 2003, in August, there was this huge blackout that impacted a big part of the eastern seaboard of North America and a little inward. You know, places like Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Boston, New York, Cleveland, Detroit, I believe, all lost power for a couple of days. And it was strange because it was in the middle of August. that I was living in Toronto at the time, working as a freelance journalist. But that day I was back home in my community, house sitting for my dad and stepmom with my 2 younger brothers. So it was weird to have the power go out like on a sunny summer day. We didn't think much of it at the time, but as the afternoon went on and the power didn't come back, we started getting a little worried, and we went into nearby Parry Sound, Ontario, to see what was going on there. And all the traffic lights and all the stores were closed there as well. So we saw some people we knew on the main street, and we talked to them, and they had heard on the radio that it was this massive blackout, and we got a little scared. We got back in the car and we went right back to the res, to our dad's house, and we started making a plan for the end of the world, essentially. You know, we started making an inventory of all the food in the cupboard at our dad's place. We started collecting firewood from the backyard in case that's how we were going to have to cook, because of course the electric stove in the kitchen was useless. But most importantly, what we did was thought about all the people around us in the community who we could go to for help, or who we could help at the same time, right? Thinking about resourceful people who knew how to go out and hunt, or who knew how to create shelter, or resourceful in other ways, like creating supplies from the land and so on. And it was really comforting to think about that, to be in this place that was our home, where we grew up, and knowing that if the world was falling apart outside of our community, we had what we needed within our community. And we had that spirit of resilience and survival already ingrained within us as Anishinaabe. And that really inspired me. And I went back to Toronto a couple days later to go back to work. And I learned that it was a little more chaotic in the city, the blackout. And I started thinking, if I want to write a story about something like this someday. And it took a long time before I actually really started to do it. Not until about 12 years after, in about 2015, was when I really started seriously writing Moon of the Crusted Snow. But that's how it came together. And another big factor was, reflecting on the post-apocalyptic or dystopian literature that I'd become familiar with up until that point, and seeing the difference between those stories and what we experienced in our community during the blackout. So in a lot of post-apocalyptic literature, what you'll see is one or two people, usually like a hero kind of figure, just trying to survive, just trying to flee the chaos or fight the bad guys, and do it on their own. And I've always said that's not really that realistic. When the chips are down and everything falls apart, what's going to help everyone survive is coming together, creating a community, thinking about the future. And those were the teachings I had as an Anishinaabe kid, which brought me back to that moment of community resilience during this catastrophe of the blackout, right? Or potential catastrophe, because it didn't end up being that bad in the end. But it gave me some good material to write about, right? So in the end, Moon of the Crusted Snow came out in 2018. So it's been out for about 3.5 years now. It's changed my life. It allowed me to quit my day job at CBC and focus primarily on being an author. And I'm working now on the sequel. It's called Moon of the Turning Leaves, and it will be published in May of next year. So that is as much as I wanted to share with you now, because I do want to get to your questions. So I will relay it back to you, and I believe Joe will come back in to join us for this part.
All right. Awesome, Wob. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thank you for bringing back those memories of the blackout. I was in university when that happened. And I think a lot of people still think in those terms of where were you when the blackout happened. Yeah. Before we turn things loose to students, there was one thing I wanted to ask you about from when you were growing up. I noticed that you spent time as an exchange student in Germany. And so you did some writing there about, being an Anishinaabe teen in a foreign country. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about that experience, what that experience was like, and maybe what you took away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. That experience is what led me to become a journalist. So I was in grade 12 at Parry Sound High School. And back in those days, way yonder then, we had what was called OAC. And if you wanted to go to university, you had to do essentially another year of high school, right? Called OAC, or more colloquially, grade 13. So I knew I wanted to go to university at that point, but I wasn't sure what for. So I was going through the hallway at Parry Sound High School, and I saw on one of the bulletin boards this flyer for this information session about, it said something like, have you ever thought about spending a year abroad? Come to this information session on this date at lunch. So I was like, okay, you know, I'll go check it out. So I went that day at lunch, and it was a member of the Rotary Club of Parry Sound, a woman named Maureen McVeigh. And she was talking about the Rotary International Student Exchange Program and what it was all about. So basically what you do is you apply, and if you're accepted, you go spend a year in a foreign country, you live with a few different families, you go to school, you travel, hopefully learn the language and the culture and so on. And I thought, okay, well, I don't know what I want to do for my career or for college or university, so I want to apply to this. And I told my parents about it that day after school, and they were very supportive. They said, okay, we will help you do this. We will support you in your application and so on. And after a very long process, I was accepted to go to Northern Germany for a year. And this was in 1996. So 26 years ago now, very, very long time ago. About a month before I left, I was contacted by the editor of a newspaper called the Anishinaabe News, a guy named Dave Dale. And the Anishinaabe News is a newspaper that covers the communities in the Anishinaabe Nation, which was then called the Union of Ontario Indians. So about 40 First Nations, you know, in central and northern Ontario, right? And in some parts of southern Ontario too. So the Dave said, hey, Wob, we heard you doing this exchange program. What would you think about writing articles for us about it? And I thought, yeah, you know, that's interesting because I really loved writing, and I thought it would be a good way to like document my experience and like keep an ongoing journal in some way that people could read. And he said, oh yeah, okay, so if you're up for it, every time we print one of your stories, we'll pay you $100. And that totally blew my mind because I didn't know that you could get paid to be a writer at that point. You know, at that point in my high school journey, no one had noticed that I liked writing and that I was curious and that I was up to date on current affairs, and that journalism could potentially be a career option for me. But thankfully, Dave showed me the way with the encouragement of a lot of other people in our community. So I went to Germany and I wrote articles about being an Anishinaabe kid in Germany, and just a lot of the sort of cultural differences I found, a lot of the stereotypes I came up against, but those were all handled and presented to me in very, you know, open-minded ways. Like none of it was ever malicious or hateful or anything like that. You know, I was basically there to clear up any misconceptions about Indigenous people as much as I could, right? Back then in the years 1996 and 1997. So I'd write about all those experiences, and Dave would print the mailing address of the family I was staying with at the end of each article. And then, you know, 2 or 3 weeks after one of those was published, I would get letters from readers, people saying, you know, thanks for being over there and sharing your experiences. Thanks for representing us as Indigenous people. And, you know, just thanks for being yourself. And that was the first time I realized that writing could have a wider impact than I even imagined. That by sharing real life experiences with other people, people can learn about the truths of others that they're not that familiar with, you know? And the other really eye-opening thing for me was knowing that the curiosity I received from Germans, I hadn't experienced really anything like that in Canada up till that point in my life, outside of people who were my family and my friends. So I had peers in my high school there who were genuinely interested in knowing about my culture and my background. Whereas, you know, living near Parry Sound and going to high school there, a place that's surrounded by 5 First Nations, at that time, I wasn't, you know, greeted with that level of enthusiasm from my peers. And I thought there is a huge divide. There's a major lack of awareness in Canada. And perhaps journalism is a way that we can help bridge some of those gaps. And that became my objective as a journalist all through my career, was to be a conduit for other Indigenous people in helping them share their truths and relaying that to other people so that they could learn about the things that the education system failed to teach them as children, you know. And thankfully, things have improved a lot, both within the education system and within media. But that was sort of the main motivating factor for me to getting into journalism. And it was as a result of going to Germany, being a student exchange student over there when I was 17 and 18 years old.
All right. Well, it sounds like an incredibly formative experience, and it just really highlights how when opportunities present themselves, even maybe they're outside your comfort zone, you should embrace them and try new things and be curious. And who knows where an experience can lead. Really
Yeah,
cool.
absolutely.
So we've got a great group of classrooms. Some of them are joining us in camera spots. Many more are joining live via YouTube. So we're going to start feeding in some of those questions. And I think there's an interesting one here that we'll start with. We have, where did that one go? Okay, we have a high school class joining us here, and they are in Ottawa, some grade 11 and 12 students. And so kind of a general question. I think everybody's definition might be a little bit different. They're asking, what is news? In your mind, what is news?
Oh, that's a really cool question. I haven't really considered that in a really long time. I think news can be what's new to you, what you can learn about the world around you, a developing event that should be important to you as a citizen of a country or as a community member, and how it's presented and packaged. I would say on behalf of journalists, as a former everyday journalist, it is done very meticulously, very properly, according to, time-honored sort of customs of doing the news, in that hopefully the best available information is getting to you as a news consumer. So news is something that's happening in the world around you that you should take note of, or should at least know about. And then you can make your own decisions from there. It's about engaging, critical thinking, but mostly about understanding your place in a community and what this information means to you. So, there's a lot of misconceptions around what journalists do. And I would say I don't have any skin in the game anymore, because I haven't worked as a full-time journalist in almost 2 years now. But, I stand with all my friends and former colleagues in the industry who are continually under barrage of, people labeling them in many unfair and unfortunate ways. They are everyday people who are there to relay the information that's supposed to be important to you. No agenda, no otherwise objectives. Everyday people who just want to help you be a good community member. So I would just urge you always to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this really well, especially in the what we're living through today, is that critical thinking is so important, that you maybe multiple sources, and then really think about what you're hearing and where it's coming from.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start bringing in some of our live groups, and let's see if they have some questions for us. So the first group we have here is hanging out with Mr. Spencer. They are grade 8s in Ottawa, Ontario. So I'm going to bring them into the call here. Hey, grade 8s, how are we doing today?
Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
All right. We'll get that microphone unmuted. If you have a question.
Any questions?
Always records us.
Oh, can you repeat that question? I didn't quite hear you.
I think everyone's shy right now.
Oh, that's okay. I thought I heard a question there. That's okay.
Mr. Spencer, we can come back to your crew, and if you shoot me a message in the private chat, I'll see it there and I'll know to come back and ask. But let's jump to another group right away here. Let's go to Gloucester High School. We've got some students joining us there. I'm going to bring them into the call.
Hello. There are students behind me. It's just we don't have a good platform for this.
That's okay. Good to see you.
And we had 2 questions.
Yes.
One being,
Who inspires you?
who inspires you? And the other one being,
Do you have any book recommendations by Indigenous authors?
Oh, good questions. Well, I will say who inspires me mostly is young people of all backgrounds. What I'm seeing unfold today in what we call Canada is a better relationship amongst people of different backgrounds than I saw when I was your age. And I see young people working hard to be themselves and understand as much as they can about other people in their community of different backgrounds. And it's really heartwarming now because, as I mentioned, I have two little boys, one that's 5 and one that's 1.5 years, and they're growing up in this world. You know, they are coming into the world that you're making for them. And I feel very comforted when I see so many of you working hard together to make this a good place, you know. So that's what inspires me the most. Also, what inspires me is when young people look to their elders, because the elders always inspire me. And elders are anybody that's older than them, not necessarily an elderly person, but a grown up or, you know, someone just a couple years older than them, their peers or whatever. There's something very valuable about lived experience. And it's important to recognize what someone has gone through in order to figure out, you know, what we need to do to make our community a better place, you know. And lived experience comes with a lot of different sort of definitions and a lot of different elements. But I think at the core of all of this is good communication and an open mind and tolerance of everybody. So I think seeing that relationship form in a community, I think led by the young people, is what inspires me the most. I have lots and lots of book recommendations. It's really hard for me to answer this question, and I'm always really nervous when I get it because I know I'm going to leave some people out. But I would recommend a novel called 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good. It's you know, a difficult story. It's about residential school survivors, but it is very unique in that it is a fictional tale that follows survivors from the moment they are released from or escape residential school all throughout the rest of their lives. So that's not something we see often in fiction, and I think Michelle has done that really well, and she's won a lot of awards for it. You know, other books by young people include A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott, poetry like This Wound is a World by Billy Ray Belcourt, you know, a novel by Joshua Whitehead called Johnny Appleseed is excellent as well. But also I will take this opportunity to quickly plug a podcast that I do about Indigenous literature called Storykeepers. So just Google Storykeepers podcast and you can see a list of the books that we've discussed lately. You know, those aren't all of my recommendations, obviously. You know, I have many, many more that I could suggest, but that's a potential place to start.
All right. Great question from our Gloucester High School crew. Awesome stuff. I'm looking online here. There's lots of questions coming in via YouTube. So I want to pick a few interesting ones here. One, this is from a school in British Columbia, Burnaby School. They are wondering about, is there anything that you've drawn upon recently that's inspired you in the writing of the sequel?
Oh, yes, for sure. Well, the pandemic has been a pretty major event for all of us. And when I started developing the sequel was in the spring of 2020. So right, you know, after the pandemic was declared. What I was inspired by in those first months was how people were coming together at first, and especially around the ideas of food security and food sovereignty and so on. Because I think what people realized is, some of you will remember, you know, there was panic buying happening at the grocery stores. You know, people were buying up all the stuff on the shelves and so on. And some people were starting to realize that a lot of us, especially in urban centers, are reliant upon food that comes in from elsewhere, you know, either on a truck or on a train or whatever else, you know. So in that sense, a lot of people started thinking about, oh, maybe we should think more about growing food at home, or, you know, thinking about what we can do to have good community-based food development and so on, right? So that's really what encouraged me. And I think, you know, I'm currently writing about like end of the world scenarios. And I think that's one thing that's going to help us anytime, whether it's the end of the world or any other kind of crisis or just our everyday lives, is understanding and fostering a better relationship with the food that we consume, and how we can be better community members and citizens of the earth by enacting good practices around us, whether it's growing our food or harvesting it from nearby, so that we're not so reliant on food coming in from other places. So yeah, that was definitely very influential and inspiring to me when I started working on the sequel, for sure.
All right. And, it's interesting, and maybe that's just a product of the news that seems to get covered is we don't always hear about some of those good news stories about how people are working together, how communities are pulling together. We tend to have highlighted or focused kind of the negative things that are happening because those do draw eyes. But yeah, it's just as important to really highlight all the good things that have come from the pandemic and how so many communities have pulled together and worked together. Not everybody was buying all the toilet paper.
That's right.
All right. Let me bring in another classroom live here. We're going to go back to Ottawa. We've got another grade 8 crew hanging out with us. I'm going to bring them into the call here. There we go. Hey, York Street grade 8s. How are we doing today?
Hi, everybody.
All right. Do you guys have a question for us? We'll just need you to grab the mic and unmute it for us so we can hear the question. Okay, I see head shaking, so I will come back to your class. Let me know in the side if you do end up having a question. But Mr. Spencer's crew, who we visited earlier, they sent in a question via the private chat. It's a great one. And they're wondering, oops, I lost it there. Where did it go? There it is. So they're wondering when you wrote something, maybe it was an article or something, and maybe it wasn't received well or didn't do well. How do you stay motivated when something you wrote maybe didn't come out the way you hoped or wasn't received the way you hoped it would be?
That's a really good question. I think I would just have to remind myself that if it reached anybody, then that is a success in and of itself, right? No matter how many people read it, as long as I've had a platform and the opportunity to relay a story or information through that platform, that is, the primary sort of objective for me is being in that position. And that's what I remind myself, that it's always a privilege. It's an honor to be able to do these kinds of things. And if a story, whatever shape it took, whether it was like an article or a short story or a book or an interview or whatever else, I think as long as it has reached just, a small handful of people, even that's a major success, right? And even then, like if it didn't quite elicit the response that I was hoping for, and the responses I would hope for aren't like praise or accolades for me, it's interest in the story itself, right? It's the story itself resonating with people. That's what I want a story to do. If that particular story didn't do that, I would just remind myself, hey, tomorrow is another opportunity to do it. And maybe there are things I could do better with the next story or the next opportunity to present something like that, right? So there's always another day ahead. And maybe it's sort of an idealistic or maybe naive way to look at life, but that has got me through to this point in my life, right? I'm 42 years old now. And I think picking myself up after, whatever failures I've had and trying again as hard as I can has brought me through. And again, I just make sure that I express my gratitude for all the opportunities that I've had.
All right. Absolutely. And, a lot of people don't have a platform. So it's exciting to have that platform, be able to put things out there. And yeah, not everything is going to resonate with everybody, but you're right. Some people reading it will take something away, and there'll be some kind of effect from that writing.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so here's an interesting question. We've got a classroom in Brantford, and so they're wondering, how do you feel about non-Indigenous authors who write stories about Indigenous people?
Really good question. And that's always a timely topic. I think it's a good thing as long as it's done properly and respectfully. As long as there is inclusion and an opportunity for the community or the nation that's being written about to have a say, to be consulted about it, then I think it's a great thing. That can help build relationships, that can promote mutual awareness and understanding, and it can reach wider audiences when that sort of partnership happens. So what I don't think should happen is just somebody writing about a community that they've never been to, or people they've never actually met or discussed anything with, because that will not be an accurate representation of what that community or its residents are. There has to be that consultation happening, no matter where you're from. And that includes amongst Indigenous nations. For me, I would never write about a Mohawk community myself without having a relationship with people from that particular community. I would not just take the information that's readily available out there, mostly online, and then write my own story about it. That's unethical. There needs to be some respect at the core of that storytelling process. So yes, it can happen for sure, especially amongst non-Indigenous people, but there has to be that outreach happening, and there has to be, that intent that's clear, and there has to be a mutual understanding of what that story is going to be if someone from outside of that community is going to write about it.
Okay, there's so many great questions coming in via the chat. It's hard to choose them, but we've got a grade 9 class joining us, and they know an author is always writing, rewriting, editing, revisiting their writing. So maybe without giving anything too much away from the book, is there anything you would add or change to Moon of the Crusted Snow?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, the fortunate opportunity for me is that I'm writing part 2. So anything that I think I might have overlooked or missed in the first one, I'm including in the second one, right? So what happened with Moon of the Crested Snow, it's fairly short, it's about 218 pages, I believe. The first draft was about 75,000 words, and the final version is about 60,000 words. So that's about 50 pages altogether, we cut from it. And the main reason my editor, Susan Renouf, and I cut that much was for the sake of pacing, because everything that was in there before slowed down the story. And it's supposed to be kind of like a thriller, right? Like it's supposed to be something that moves at a really good pace. So that's why we had to cut all those things out of there. And it was Susan's guidance that really helped me do that. Some of the things that were cut, though, were important, I think, character elements or traits that I think would have made the story a little bit richer. For example, one of the characters is Two-Spirit, but we don't get to go too deep into him or his background because it's a thrilling story, right? So we don't get to learn that much about him, but he's going to be in part 2, so we do learn a bit more about him and his family and so on, right? And there are other things like that, there are some scenes that we cut, so I could modify them and use them in a different way for the sequel, And yeah, I'm trying to be careful because I don't want to give too much away in case you haven't read it. But that's the prime opportunity that I have now, and I'm just so grateful for that I can revisit some of the things that I would have liked to expand upon in the first book, and I can do that in the second one. So it's a good question.
All right, great question. And it's that kind of that tricky balance to keep the story moving and keep it kind of fast paced,
yeah, exactly.
But still develop the characters and make the reader feel like they're getting to know the people as well. All right, let's jump back to Gloucester High School and see if they have a follow-up question for us before we wrap up today.
We don't have a follow-up question, but we're really appreciative of your response, especially considering we have a lot of different youth within this group who are very creative in themselves, and we always welcome elders and other knowledge holders into our community space here. So yeah, really, really great to hear that your inspiration comes from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you. I appreciate that. It's just great to visit with you all in this way today.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you.
Well, great to have your crew joining us live today. Okay, let's see what, maybe grab one or two more burning questions from YouTube. This should be a nice easy one. We have another group in British Columbia who are curious about a favorite food, a favorite traditional food that you really enjoy.
Oh yeah, I love wild rice. That's my namesake. My name isn't Rice just randomly. My ancestors are originally from down south, the Anishinaabe of the Wisconsin area, the Menominee people more specifically, a branch of the Potawatomi people. And Menominee means rice. in our languages. So, when one of my ancestors moved from, well, he left, he was essentially chased out of the United States due to the Indian Removal Act signed by President Andrew Jackson back in the 1830s. When he was eventually pushed out, he moved up to the Georgian Bay area. And when he registered as an Indian, quote unquote, under the Indian Act, he was forced to change his name from Menominee to Rice because that's the literal translation. The government said, well, if you want to be an Indian under the Indian Act, you got to change that name. So that's why, my family is called Rice now. So wild rice is part of our heritage. I have not properly learned to harvest it, although I've been out with family members to do that. But it means a lot to me, not just as a traditional food, but as part of my family history and my heritage.
Okay. This question has actually come up a few times, I think, just based on our kind of little discussion about your time in Germany. So a few of the classrooms are curious to know, what types of stereotypes did you encounter when you were in Germany?
Well, this is a story I tell a lot. I won't tell the whole thing because it's kind of long. But when I showed up for my first day of school, like in the equivalent of the high school there were a lot of kids there who came out to meet me because they heard that there was an Indian coming to their school. But I was dressed much like I am now, with a black t-shirt and jeans. And I didn't have long hair then. I had like a buzz cut. And a buddy told me later, he's like, yeah, we were actually disappointed when we saw you because we thought you'd have like a loincloth on and like no shirt, moccasins and all that. And that's honestly what they thought because, they didn't have any current or modern frame of reference for Indigenous people. All they knew was like the Hollywood version of Indians, right? And this was, again, just to remind you, it was back in the 1990s before everybody had access to the internet and so on. So that was one, people assumed that I was going to show up as like this dude in a loincloth kind of thing. They're like some of the more negative stereotypes too that result from, those ignorant sort of perceptions, like, everybody being a drunk or, stuff like nasty stuff like that. But, it was easy to debunk those myths just by being an everyday person and being amongst them, and showing them that like, I'm a human being just like you guys. Right. So, there was other stuff like, do you know how to do a rain dance or, like just silly stuff mostly. But again, as I said earlier, like I was never met with any sort of malice when I had these discussions with people because they were genuinely interested and they valued me as a person and my experiences. And they wanted to learn from me, which was like really empowering for someone who was 17 from the reserve, and that really, I think, instilled the confidence in me to continue to see the world, to continue to be curious about it, and to think about ways to not just educate or make people aware, but, be a community member with everybody, no matter where I go, and fostering that sense of mutual understanding and humanity. That's, what I learned from that experience, thanks to like busting some of those silly stereotypes, so it was kind of fun too at times, like watching people squirm when I like, was able to tease them a bit about the things they had wrong, and I think a lot of people are familiar with that kind of, that kind of practice when you're busting myths, but yeah, those were some of them.
Yeah. And I mean, you really can't blame them when they're exposed to certain stories only being told by a certain group of people, media that comes over. So yeah, that's why it's so exciting to see so many more Indigenous voices throughout the arts and throughout the media being able to share their stories and really be ambassadors to kind of dispel those stereotypes and tell real stories, meaningful stories. So I think as we're wrapping up, Wab, I think one more thing I'd just like to touch on before we wrap up is you've written nonfiction, you've written fiction. Is there a style that you tend to gravitate towards more?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I'm working primarily in fiction right now. Excuse me. So I think I probably gravitate more towards that, mostly because, I worked in nonfiction for so long, nonfiction being journalism, I guess you could say. And that was a really, fulfilling career for me. And it was always just an honor to be able to share people's stories. And again, as I said earlier, what I really appreciated was the opportunity to reflect realities and to help make other people aware of other people's truths and so on. I didn't take that for granted at all. But what I found, and at CBC has so many awesome opportunities to do that kind of thing, whether it was just news stories or documentaries or radio interviews or web features or whatever else. Because CBC is multimedia, there were just so many different ways that I was able to do that, which I really appreciated. However, there are still confines there. There are still time limits, there are still space limits, and so on. So what I really like about fiction right now is that it gives me an opportunity to offer more context, because there aren't really any limits to space in fiction. Like I can go deep into what someone's experience can be, even though it's a made up person. They're rooted in real people. The fictionalized characters I write about, they're combinations of people and so on, and the experiences are all real, obviously. So I can offer a lot more context in fiction, I find, and I can offer a lot more of the human elements to Indigenous realities in ways that I couldn't do in journalism or in that kind of nonfiction, I guess you could say, right? So that's why I love fiction now. I don't think I'll ever go back to being a journalist like I was before, but I will, dabble in it from time to time. But for now, I'm just having fun with fiction.
All right. Well, it's always great when you can turn your passion into your career. It just makes days more exciting. It makes work feel less like work. Before I wrap up, I do just want to give another shout out to the legacy schools and classrooms that are joining us today. Always great to have you with us for these events. If you are not a legacy school or classroom, do take some time to visit the DWF.ca, and you can find all the information about becoming one of those schools, one of those classrooms, and find some great resources and a great way that your classrooms can start participating in reconciliation through Reconciliation. I also do want to highlight the events. We have events coming up in March and April. So do visit exploringbytheseat.com and look for the DWF live events, and you can find those events there. A shout out to all of our camera classrooms and all of our classrooms live on YouTube. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for all those great questions. It was hard to choose which questions we were going to have time to get in today. And Wab, it was such a pleasure to meet you. Such a pleasure to hear some of your story and your process. Thank you so much for sharing that with classrooms across Canada today.
Oh, Miigwech, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thanks everybody for joining today. It's been a really enjoyable experience. So Miigwech.
All right. Well, have a great rest of the week, everybody. We hope to see you in more DWF live events. But for now, we're going to sign off. Thanks, everyone.